The context of this passage, again, we're still in disruption in the church. We've dealt with one issue relative to the men. We've dealt with one issue relative to women and that how they dress and how they carry themselves. Paul is now moving into the issue of disruption caused by leadership. And so he's going to talk here about women and leadership issues. And then chapter 3, he's going to talk about elders and leadership. And then he's going to talk about deacons and leadership. So we're really beginning here a topic that carries all the way through chapter 3. So Paul says, let a woman learn quietly. And again, this is going to be my interpretive positions. Let a woman learn quietly. And then he defines quietly by saying, I mean in submissiveness. Quietly means submissive. Then he's going to spell out in details what that means. He says, I don't permit a woman, and I believe the structure is that he's limiting women's roles in two areas. I don't allow a woman to teach, and I don't allow women to exercise authority over a man. Rather than doing that, she is to, and again, I don't like the translation, remain quiet. This was I believe this phrasing is ESV, right? Yeah. And what he's doing is he's providing bookends where you've got, let a woman learn quietly, she is to remain quiet. So this, whatever hesuchia means, the translated quiet, is what's bookending this discussion, and that becomes very, very important. So that's the opening up into this discussion. Let a woman learn quietly. First of all, there are strong statements in Jewish literature that women were not to be allowed to learn. There was one rabbi, I quoted him in the commentary, said, better to burn the Torah than let a woman learn. So what is seen as a highly restrictive passage also was actually quite revolutionary, is that Paul sees that women have a role where they should be learning. So that needs to be pointed out. But as women learn, they are to do so hesuchia. All right, translated quietly. What does this word mean? Well, the word can mean silence. The word can mean absolute silence. There are hesuchia, and its cognates occur, I think it's 8 times, and it's split 50-50. 50% of the times, the word and its cognates mean absolute quiet. There was the protest in the temple, and when they heard Paul speaking in Aramaic, they became quiet. Okay, so there are cases where it means absolute quiet. The problem is that 1 Corinthians 11:5 guarantees women a vocal role in the public worship service. And so I just had a hard time believing that what Paul says is they absolutely have to keep their mouth completely and totally shut. I don't think that's what's going on. The word doesn't necessarily mean it. If the issue is one of submissiveness, submissiveness does not require total silence. Those are two different things, right? And perhaps most importantly, the cognate, I think it's a cognate, occurs up in 1 Timothy 2:2. Let me double check my Greek. In 1 Timothy, I'm not texting, I'm checking my Bible. It is 1 Timothy 2:2. It's hesuchion. Yeah, it's a cognate. It's hesuchias, isn't it? Yeah, it's a cognate that I want women that I want people to live a peaceful and quiet life. Does Paul want us to live a life that's absolutely silent? No, that's not what it means. So while it is a cognate, which means it doesn't necessarily have exactly the same meaning, it does have the same basic meaning. So you have the use of the word not to mean silent, but a quiet kind of life. And so that, I think, is a pretty strong argument that just a few verses later, that it's Paul is not requiring the women to not even open their mouths, but it is dealing with their demeanor. It is dealing with an attitude of submissiveness. So that's why I came out in that position in the commentary. The problem is, submissive to whom? Submissive to whom? And there are people that will argue that it means submissive to any and all men. And they get the man from the middle part of verse 12. I don't permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. So the object of the authority and the object of the submissiveness would be the same thing. So let a woman learn quietly, being submissive to the men in the church. Amen. The problem is that is nowhere taught in Paul. And there is no way that my wife and daughter are called by the Bible to be submissive to every one of you. That's just not a biblical, that's not biblical. There are people who say it is, I just think that they're wrong. And I just don't think there's any passage in Scripture that teaches submission of any and every woman to any and every man. So I just don't think that's what it says. I don't think it's Pauline. The place where I come out in the commentary is that the submission is to the ruling elders in the church. And that may be men, depending upon what we're going to do later on with the passage. But I think that because the context is one of learning, and because the people who were the primary responsible for teaching in the church were the elders, that when you start talking about learning submissively, that you are being submissive to the teachers, to the elders in the church. And so you don't know this about me. I'm really cautious about going beyond the text. I really, really don't like adding to the text. There's something in Revelation about that. And I'm very, very careful about that. But because Paul doesn't teach submissiveness of all women to any and all men, there has to be some kind of contextual limiter on this verse. And so because it's a teaching and a learning experience, I think it's submissiveness to the ruling authorities. And again, you have to quickly point out, men that were not leaders in the church were also called to be submissive to their authorities, right? So this is just not a female thing. This is how we are to learn, that God has gifted the church with administrators, with lots of different gifts, but some of those gifts are teachers and evangelists. And when you have a teacher who is in a position of official leadership in the church, then the people in the church are called to respect that person and to submit to him, submit to the authority. I think it's the language in Hebrews, right? I think that's where that passage is. Now, I reread the commentary last night on this, and it was just a reminder how many things are different angles there are on approaching this text. And you're going to hear me say this over and over again the next hour about some of the theories that I don't agree with. And that is, it just doesn't say it. Now, sometimes things are implied in the text, I understand that. But one of the things that is often said is that Paul is saying that women must learn quietly in submissiveness so that once they know, they can teach. Have you heard that argument? It's a very common one. That this is not a permanent learning in submissiveness, but it is a learning so that they can eventually teach. And I think the answer is, it's not what the text says. It's not what the text says. Whole books are written around that thesis, or articles, I should say. It doesn't say that. And so I'm not going to go there. There are many reasons for women to learn, and men too. And not all of them are to move into leadership. You learn the Torah so that you can be obedient to the Torah. Lots of reasons to learn that don't involve becoming a teacher. So we start out by saying, let a woman learn quietly. And by quietly, I'm not talking about dead silence. I mean in a submissive attitude, and I'm interpreting it submissive to the teaching authority of the church, something that men and women likewise are called to do. Paul then in verse 12 restates verse 11, but with an eye to a practical application. Is the connection I think there is between 11 and 12. And he says, I don't permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man, as opposed to teaching and exercising authority. She is to be in hesukia. She is to be in quietness. She is to be in submissiveness. I tried to get the ESV to agree instead of quietly to quietness. It's not really good English, and it's probably why it didn't pass the vote. But it was. I wanted some word that allowed for speech and put the focus on demeanor. But I don't think there is a word in English that does that. That was the problem. We couldn't come up with it. With the ESV, well, that's probably a little too interpretive for the ESV, and it's multiple words to translate a single English word, and so in the ESV there's a preference to try to keep one-to-one, if you can. Something like that would fit more in an NIV theory of translation or an NLT. Okay. Almost every single word in this verse is questioned. And again, let me just go through them, the documentations and the commentary, but I want to give you make sure you're aware of broad stroke of what the issues are. First of all, I didn't get very far into the verse. There are some people who argue that when he says I, that he's stating his personal opinion, not fact. And that people are comfortable saying, well, that's his opinion, but it's not my opinion. And they often make reference to Paul's discussion of marriage in 1 Corinthians 7. And there's a couple of different places in 1 Corinthians 7. In verses 10 and 12, he says, to the married I give this charge. And he says, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband. And then in verse 12, to the rest I say, I, not the Lord. That if a brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and he goes on. And the argument is that Paul is giving his opinion that does or does not have to be followed. The problem with that is generally accepted, is that Paul is not saying some of this is fact, some of this is opinion. He's simply identifying the source of the authority. That in one of these, when he says, not I, but the Lord, he's saying this is the Jesus tradition. When he says, I, not the Lord, he's saying this is what I authoritatively teach. And that's pretty much understood, I think, in 1 Corinthians 7. That it's not an opinion versus fact. The other place they go is verses 25 and 26, where he says, now concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, so no Jesus tradition. But I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Now, Paul, in that passage, is certainly giving his opinion, but we know it's his opinion not because he says I, but because he contextually makes it very clear, this is my preference, do with it as you wish. Right? In fact, he goes on to say, if you really want to get married, go ahead. It's nothing wrong. And so it's not the fact that he says I that makes it his opinion. It's the fact that he says it's his opinion that makes it. His opinion. So we come back to our passage and it says, I do not permit. This is the Apostle Paul speaking. This is the apostle who tells the Thessalonians that if someone doesn't listen to what I say and if he doesn't work hard, then socially ostracize him. I mean, Paul expected the church to follow every single thing that he said, unless he specifically said, this is my opinion. So I don't think that drawing attention to the I is that significant. I do not permit, present tense verb. The comment is made that the tense is saying that this is only temporary. In fact, they will translate it, I am not permitting a woman, or interpretively, I am currently not permitting a woman. And so the argument is that because it's a present tense verb, it's only temporary. The fact of the matter is that is not what the Greek present tense says. That the essence of the Greek tense in the present is to not look at the beginning or the end. It's to describe something as a process, and it says nothing about the conclusion of an action. The quotes, the references are in the commentary to the grammars that make this clear. That there is nothing inherent in the present tense that implies that the present action is a temporary action. It may be a temporary action, but it's not the present tense that's going to convey that meaning. It'll be something else in the context that makes it clear. And I go through, and I've actually gotten quite a few emails on this part of the commentary, people thanking me for it, because I start identifying all the present tense verbs that we take as eternal. And there's thousands of them. And if the present tense, by definition, is describing something that's temporary, then God only temporarily wants all people to be saved. Then wanting to be an elder is only temporarily a good thing. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. I think there are some arguments against the position that I've taken that are good arguments and that you really need to think carefully about and extend a lot of grace to, and saying, well, that could be possible. This is not one of them. This just simply isn't what the Greek tense, present tense means. And I don't think there's any question about it. But so some people say, I am currently not permitting, but the idea is that once they have learned, then I'm going to permit them to do other activities. I do not permit a woman, and I should say, and I went looking for this in the commentary, and I think if I do a second edition, I'm going to make a bigger deal of this. The word translated woman can also be wife. And there are reasons for treating this as a man-woman thing, not a husband-wife thing. But I got to tell you, the more I think about it, the more I wonder if the husband-wife isn't more prominent. Now, the arguments are, why would you limit the role of a wife but not of a single gal? And the answer may be because the issue is marital relations, husband, wife, and how husbands and wives relate to each other, and not so much how any man and any woman relate to each other. I just find myself wondering more and more about that decision and whether I gave it enough time to think through it. So if I get to do a second edition, you'll see a lot more discussion on whether this is a woman or a wife thing. But most people go with a woman in this passage. In other words, all women, single or married.
If you took the husband-wife thing, could it still apply to public worship?
Yeah, it would be how husbands and wives are to relate to each other in the public worship setting. And then elsewhere you have how husband and wives relate to each other in private settings. I mean, we have all those teachings in Paul as well. So, again, it's just, I'm not willing to say I'm going to go there, but I'm going to think a lot more about it, I think.
I think 1 Corinthians 14 comes into play where it says that the women should ask their husbands at home.
Yeah, we have, there, again, that would be a good argument that, this is silence and not quietness, and that submissiveness means that the women need to wait till they get home to ask the wives need to wait till they get home to ask their husbands. But here's the problem. There, first of all, almost everyone was married. But you would also have the women going home and asking their fathers. I mean, it's really very, very complicated as how it does. I'm just saying, this is an issue that I've not seen discussed a whole lot, and I think it's one that's worth being discussed. But most people refer that this is a woman thing and not a wife thing. I don't permit a woman to teach. All right. Teach what? Teach where? Paul, give us an object. There is no object. He just says teach. And so it raises all kinds of questions. And let me try to cover what some of those questions are. I was scribbling this last night, and I can't read my handwriting. Just a second. Some people will say that what Paul is prohibiting is that I do not permit a woman to teach heresy. In other words, they supply the object of the false teachers. The counter-argument is it's not what it says. And why would Paul say, I don't permit a woman to teach what is false? Wouldn't he say, I don't permit people to teach what is false? What is there? Why would, if it's a matter of teaching heresy, teaching the false teachings, why limit it just to women? What makes this argument stronger is that it appears, again, this is an interpretive issue, but it appears that the actual teachers who were teaching the false doctrine were all men. Every indication we have is that the false teachers themselves were men. Now, we know that the false teaching was having a dramatic effect within the female community. Among the young widows, 1 Timothy 5. And the assumption is certainly they would have been promulgating the false teaching as well. But if there were clear evidence that the false teachers were women, then it would make a little more sense to understand the object of teach as teach heresy. Well, because we don't have any evidence that the women were actually leading the false teaching, then it makes that supplying that object a little more difficult. And again, it introduces all other kinds of problems. The other argument that's made against the idea of teaching heresy is that the words teach in the pastorals are unanimously positive. In other words, when he talks about teaching, he's talking about teaching the gospel. He's not talking about teaching bad things. He's talking about teaching the gospel, teaching good things. And when Paul wants to say, like, to teach false teachings or to teach other teachings, like we saw in 1 Timothy 1, the word actually says it's heterodidaskalos. It's to teach other things. But the idea of teaching as a noun or teaching as a verb in the pastorals is always a positive thing. It's always teaching the gospel. And so, again, there would have to be some pretty strong contextual clues that he's talking about teaching something other than the gospel, just because of how the word is used. Does that make sense? All right. So I think it's, I don't permit a woman to teach the gospel is the idea. But you also have not only the idea of teaching what, but teaching where. What is the context? What is the social context of this verse? Again, there are some people that will say it's ubiquitous. It's absolutely everywhere. Women can't teach, period. The problem, of course, with that is that it contradicts Scripture. It contradicts Scripture in the pastorals. It contradicts other passages in Scripture where women clearly are instructing. We'll kind of avoid the problem by using a different verb. By instructing others. It doesn't actually say that Priscilla taught Apollos, but she instructed him. She and her husband instructed him. You know, the argument is, well, the name Priscilla's name before her husband, so she was the primary teacher, is one of the arguments. And I go, well, I don't know, maybe she was a sanguine and he was a quiet person, and you know, maybe she was vivacious and he was boring. You know, maybe they just named her first because the person, I mean, we don't know why her name is first. And it's part of the frustrating thing in dealing with this whole debate is so much can be made by some people of what's not there or what's between the lines. There's no indication that Priscilla was viewed as an official teacher in the church and that she becomes an example for how other women are to behave. The teaching, and which is where I'm getting the Priscilla and Aquila teaching of Apollos was a private thing in their home. So the other question is, I don't permit a woman to teach. Is there a spatial limitation? And I think yes. I think we're talking about the assembled church. And now I have friends that want to extend beyond this. I have friends I have friends that think this is all first century and doesn't apply at all. Gordon Fee is a very good friend of mine. I've spent hours with Gordon because I respect him so much, and I want to understand. I did not want to misrepresent his position. And Gordon graciously, when he didn't know me from Adam, we spent 2 long breakfasts together at national meetings saying, Gordon, help me understand your position. I love your commentary on Corinthians. I love your commentary on Philippians. I respect you, but I disagree with you on this, and I don't like disagreeing with people I respect so much. So help me understand your position. And Gordon did. Very cautiously and generously. I disagree with Professor Fee on this point. So I have very good friends that say that this is totally first century, totally Ephesian. I have other friends that say that I don't permit a woman to teach applies to everything. They don't like women teaching in universities. They don't like women teaching economics in universities. I mean, non-biblical things. Understand, there's a wide variety here. And there's just no way this refers to secular education. We have women teaching women. We have women teaching children. We have many different ways in which women are able to instruct, let's just say, other people. And so there has to be some kind of contextual limitation. And I think Paul is not saying, he's saying that women are not to take a primary teaching role in the assembled church, which gets back to your verse on 1 Corinthians 14. By the way, people will say sometimes to me, so I hear you have a problem with women teaching. My answer is always, no, I don't have any problem at all. That's the problem. Paul has a problem with it. I don't have a problem with it, but Paul does, and I have to follow the text. You know, it gets interesting, doesn't it? Okay, what about parachurch organizations? What about Sunday schools? I mean, this is an issue. And again, what I would encourage you to do is for class is to do the position paper on leadership and get all your verses together. If you have elders, get with your elders. Come to a conclusion, write it out. Let the young girls in your church know why they may or they may not do things in the church. When I preached through 1 Timothy at our church, and when I got to this passage, I was a little hesitant, didn't know what was going to happen. I thought I'd be okay. I thought I'd earned trust from the church at this point, and so I wasn't expecting to be tarred and feathered. And I went through the passage, and do you know what the largest group of people after the sermon, this is terrible English, what the largest group was? It was the teenage girls. And I saw them coming and go, oh, I'm going to get crucified. And they, to a person, said, thank you. We've never understood why all the preachers around here are men. At least we know now. There's a reason. They had never been taught there was a reason. So that's why I like these position papers so much. It's not an issue of orthodoxy. It's not an issue of gospel, but it gives you a chance to go through the data and to interpret it, have your elders agree, disagree, refine, however you want to do it, and then say, hey, at least there are reasons. We may be wrong, but at least there are reasons for why we do what we do. You know, do you baptize right away, which is the only biblical model? Or do you wait until we're really sure the salvation experience has taken hold of the person? Or do you get it out of your way when you're babies, Presbyterians? Yeah, these position papers, I think, are just wonderful tools. Anyway, Let especially the young girls in your church know why. The position that I came to is that when it says, I do not permit a woman to teach, the position I came to was that I don't permit a woman to teach the gospel in an authoritative fashion within the context of the assembled church. That's just where I came out. I had a friend at Gordon Conwell who said at the end of the day that the people who have the responsibility to say this is the official doctrine of the church are the elders, and they are to be men. And I just, it's not a position I'm crazy about. I don't like being persecuted. It's not my personality, but I think the text is pretty clear that that's what it means. So anyway, teaching what, teaching where. This is why the 1 Timothy 3, 14, 15, and 16 are so important to me, because they provide a context, I think, from 2:1 and following. Okay, I don't permit a woman to teach. That's an expression of what submissiveness is. And then he says, or to exercise authority over a man. And it gets really, really complicated at this point. What is the relationship between teach and exercise authority? And I've given you the references so that if you want to read, there's some really good articles. Baldwin does one and Kostenberger does one that really spells out what exercise authority means and what the relationship of or is. And the conclusion that I came to was that teaching is the specific application, and that exercise authority is a general principle. Now, there is a position, Phil Payne argues for it. In fact, if you want to have some fun reading, in Jets, I forget who came first, but Phil Payne and Doug Moo went back and forth. And what's helpful is to hear an argument, then hear the counter-argument, then hear the counter-argument. And it's a very, very helpful interchange. And I think of all the stuff that I read, and I read a lot, that exchange was the most helpful, because it's just fun to see two scholars interacting. And so if this is something that you really want to pursue, I would encourage you to pick up those articles and look at them. It's all summarized in the commentary, but if you want to do that. All right. Payne's position is that teaching and exercise authority is a single event, and that it's a teaching in a domineering way. And so the prohibition is not so much the act of teaching, but it's the act of teaching poorly. I don't think that he proved his point. I think Kostenberger did a better job at arguing, and Moo did a better job of arguing as to the nature of what or means in Greek. And I think that the exercise authority is the principle, and teaching is one expression of how a person exercises authority. Let me talk about the exercise authority issue. This is a hapaxagomenon. This is the only place it occurs in the Bible. It's authenteo. It's a rare, rare word. And I don't know why Paul used such a rare word. But, Jesus says, give us this day our blank bread. Epiousia. It doesn't occur anywhere else in extant Greek literature. And I want to ask Jesus, when you're teaching someone to pray, why did you use a word that no one ever uses? Why would you do that? I'm really curious what his answer is going to be, if I care enough about it to ask him when I get there. But I do want to ask Paul, why did you choose such a rare word that it is hard to define? No, it's authenteo. Oh, I would expect something like exousia or something, that kind of a word that I'm used to. Here's the two basic positions on authenteo. Authenteo can mean to simply possess authority. So to exercise authority over a man. If authenteo means the mere possession of authority, then what Paul is prohibiting is in fact that. It's a woman being in a position that puts her in a position of authoritative power over a man/husband. All right. The other possible meaning of authenteo is to domineer. In other words, it's to not just possess power, but to grasp for power, to long for the power, to use power in a bad way. And so if that's what authenteo means, it means that Paul is saying, I don't permit a woman to exercise authority improperly over a man. Yeah. Yeah, so that's what the King James is. Well, I don't know what usurp meant 400 years ago, but it's how we read it today, to usurp authority. And that's why if you look at some of the different translations, you can see them struggling with this particular one. In the ESV, we went with, I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man, what you have in the phrasing. If you go to the new NIV, it's, I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority. Okay, so the NIV is going with the second possible meaning. Kind of fun to see what some of these other folks come up with. HCSB, the Southern Baptist one. Yeah, have authority. I wonder what the NLT does. To have authority? Okay. So most of the translations are, actually I wonder what the NRSV does. That would be the other one that'd be interesting to watch. I don't have, does anyone have the NRSV is have authority. That's very interesting. That puts the NIV out there by itself. At least of those translations. But anyway, that's the dividing factor. Is Paul prohibiting the possession of institutional authority, or is it the wrongful exercise of authority? So you have the same whole range of questions. Why would Paul prohibit a woman to domineer and not people to domineer? I mean, anyone who exercises authority in a coercive way should be stopped, right? Anyway, there's ongoing discussions. The article by, I think this one was it Kostenberger? Anyway, the references in the commentary. It's laborious reading, but yeah, it was Kostenberger that argued that, I think very convincingly, that authenteo means the possession of authority, not how you work out your authority. I think it fits the context better, and I think it's what the word means. But I can't go through the argument here. It'd be way too long. So it appears to be, at least to me, what Paul is saying is that it is my rule that women in general are not allowed to teach the gospel, and I would say in a manner in which they're saying, this is what we believe, this is the church's official position. I think the implicit contrast here is between the women in general and the elders. It's not men in general, it's the elders. And the elders are called to be to lead the church by teaching. They're the ones that are to declare, thus believeth the church, so to speak. And that is the role that is left for the elders. And the Ephesian women were trying to do that, and Paul was saying that they couldn't. I don't permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. This is the hard one. This is a hard one. Who is the man? Is it every man, any man? Is it husband? Or is it elders? And again, this is one of those places where, I was nervous when I wrote this part because I kind of felt like I was being more interpretive than I wanted to be. But the conclusion I came to was that this authority over a man is the same thing as a submissiveness, that they're parallel to each other. And so the issue is who's running the church. And so the man here becomes the elder in my interpretation. It had been a lot easier if Paul had said elder. It would have removed a whole lot of the problems in interpreting the passage. But as it is, you have all kinds of problems with the application of this truth. Okay, how old does a boy have to be become a man? Sunday school teachers, youth group, adult ministries. You know, I mean, it makes the application of this passage difficult. And so I was a little nervous about doing this, but the conclusion I came to is that even though it says man, that contextually Paul is thinking of the male elders. Paul, when he's speaking institutionally, when he's thinking about the church gathered, when he's talking about the leadership issues of the church, that Paul wants the men to be the leaders in the church, not the women. That seems to be the general, and again, I would say general rule, because there are so many things that only women can do that men can't do. There's so many things that women should be doing in the church, but when it comes to the final, this is what we believe, this is the official doctrine of the church, this is what all people in the church, men and women together, have to submit to. I think that's the function of the elders. At least that's how I put all the pieces together. Okay, before we get on, let me just stop and say any comments or questions or.
Just one question. Going back, and I noticed that comment in your commentary about that said better for Torah than teach to a woman. And I think about when I read that, I thought about Luke 10:38 through 42, and when
What's that?
Mary and Martha,
Oh,
and
Yeah.
so I heard some commentators say the fact that Jesus even allowed them to sit there and teach or listen to him.
yeah. Yeah, Jesus and Paul are I mean, they're so often viewed in our culture as incredibly restrictive. And they were very revolutionary. They were not status quo people. I mean, they disrupted so many things. Eating with tax collectors and sinners. Sinners. And is there a difference between the two? Yes. But Jesus' willingness to associate with women in a culture that really firmly divided the genders was absolutely revolutionary. We bought a Honda the other day. It was a Honda. We bought a car for my daughter to go to school, and it was from a Muslim husband and wife, and he was the head of radiology in this hospital, and she taught Islamic women's studies at a university in Oregon. They're fascinating people to talk to, and we had a lot of interesting interchange. When I first met her, she moved her hand, something like this, and I thought she wanted to shake my hand. And I'm old enough to know that men can extend hands to men, but men don't extend, this is how I was taught, men don't extend hands to women unless the woman extends the hand. I don't know, that's how I was raised. So when I saw this hand moving, I thought she wanted to shake, and I extended my hand. Man, did her hand pull back in a hurry. And I looked at it, and she explained that in their area of Muslim philosophy, that this is part of the separation of the genders. And I really like that. I don't like hugging other women. I'm married. I'm really tired of this thing in the church where if you don't hug every woman you see, you're somehow viewed as being mean. I try to teach my sons especially, I don't know why it'd be my sons, that you shake, the handshake means something. And every time I shake one of my son's hands, he kind of looks at me like, what is wrong with you? And he gives me a hug. But I'm getting off track here. The Muslim culture has what I think to be a pretty healthy separation of the genders, of the sexes. And I think it's much more indicative of what this culture was like. So for Jesus to associate with the women, to teach the women, to let them care for his needs, I mean, this stuff should stand out as just really, really, really revolutionary. And valuing a downtrodden part of society that at that day and age, they were just objects. So I don't know how I got off on that. Anyway. Yeah, I have no idea how I got off on that. I'll watch the video. Yeah.
It's my understanding, most people take this to show the twofold roles of the eldership, teaching and authority. So is he saying women can't be elders?
Well, I mean, that's the interpretive position. You got to make up your mind on that. The church, the Pauline churches clearly had elders. The elders had to be able to teach, and I think they led by teaching. I don't think the church was led by administrators. It certainly wasn't led by businessmen. The church was led by teachers, and so you have that's the basic structure of the, I don't want to say power structure, but you know what I mean. That's the basic power structure of the church. So there are elders. The people had to submit to them, had to respect them, had to make their job a joy. And the elders likewise had to lead by teaching. That's how they led the flock. And so, that's why what is the context of this passage? Is it just broad stroke, any kind of teaching in any kind of context? I don't think so. I think it's the church is together. The church is saying, this is what we believe. That is the function of elders. And based on this passage, the elders would be males. Okay? We'll plot on through and get through these other verses. If we get through 1 Timothy 2 by lunch, that'll be great, and we'll be able to handle the 3 in the afternoon. Paul, after having said this, goes to verse 13, and he gives, and in your phrasing is marked reason 1 and reason 2. We're going to talk about whether verse 14 actually is a reason or not. But I think it's very clear that verse 13 is a reason for this. The reason for this rule is Adam was formed first, then Eve. Okay, this is, if verse 13 were not here, I would probably be an egalitarian. I think that this is that important of a verse, and it's that determinative of a verse. I just think it is.
I was thinking about this in relation to when Jesus was talking about marriage and divorce. He goes all the way back to the beginning.
Right.
As his authoritative basis.
Yep.
Was the beginning. It's kind of interesting to call that same thing.
Yep. And what Paul is basically doing, is the way it's generally stated, is that Paul is grounding his argument in creation. And he's saying, pardon? The egalitarian position sometimes will not view verse 13 as a reason. They'll view it as an illustration of what happens in Ephesus when you don't have male headship, which does not translate into our culture. I mean, that would be the standard, that would be the A way in which an egalitarian would handle the passage. But let's look at it, and I'll lay those things out for you. The question is, what does for mean? What does for mean? The most basic function of gar in Greek is called its illative use. You'll see this word used in the commentaries, illative. The illative use of gar is to give a reason. I mean, that's by default, that's what this word means. For. I've made a statement. Now I'm going to give you the reason for that statement. For. There is a very rare use of gar to introduce an illustration. So it would be, let me tell you something, and then let me illustrate something about it. And so that's what I was saying. There are people that will say that this gar is not illative. It's simply introducing an illustration. And the idea is, in Ephesus, when the women tried to assume positions of authority and teaching in the Ephesian church in the first century, that the kinds of turmoil that resulted are illustrated by the mess in Genesis 3. I don't think you can make that argument with verse 13. The non-illative function of gar is so rare that there needs to be something in the context that says, I'm not introducing a reason, I'm introducing an illustration. And in fact, and again, the stuff's in the commentary, that every single time in the New Testament, when you have an imperative or an imperatival idea, like let a woman learn, let a woman, whatever, when it's followed by gar, the gar always gives the reason. So you're going to have some pretty strong contextual reason to see verse 13 as something other than the reason for verses 11 and 12. So I think verse 13 has to be a reason. In fact, when you read the discussions of how verse 13 illustrates the kinds of things that happen in Ephesus when there's not male headship, I just don't see how Genesis 2 actually illustrates anything. It doesn't follow. Yes? Oh, okay. What Paul is doing, he's saying, this is my position on how the church is run because of what I know from Genesis 2. That's what's going on here. And here's the interesting linkage. The normal Greek word for create is ktizo. It's what you have in Genesis 1. It's kind of the default word for formed, for created, okay? Paul uses a somewhat unusual verb. It's plaso. And the question is, why plaso? And the answer is, that's the verb used in the Septuagint of Genesis 2. In other words, he's using an unusual word for formed or created because he wants you to go to Genesis 2 and in the formation of Adam and in the formation of Eve. He doesn't want you to go to Genesis 1. That's not what he's thinking about. He wants you to go to Genesis 2. And so he chooses the verb out of the Septuagint of Genesis 2 to do that. And so what he's doing is he's referring back to the whole thing that we know. Verse 18, then the Lord God said, it is not good that a man should be alone. I will make a helper fit for him. So out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and brought them to Adam to see what he would name them. He named them. But in the process of naming the animals, obviously what God's doing is saying, none of these are your helper. None of these are fit for you, right? Man and giraffe doesn't go together. Okay, that's clear. So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall on the man, and while he slept, he took one of the man's ribs, closed up its place with flesh, and the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man, in other words, Eve was created from the man, not from the ground. He made into a woman and brought her to the man. And then the man said, it is a great expression, oh, bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. Finally, someone to share my life with. I don't want to share my life intimately with lions and tigers and bears, oh my. Finally, someone that's made for me. I imagine Adam was very relieved at that point. So it's that whole story that Paul is referring to. And he says Adam was formed first, then Eve. And that whole story in Genesis 2 and how Eve was created from Adam and for Adam and everything that goes on in Genesis 2 is the argument as to why he has male headship in the official structures of the church, verses 11 and 12. Men and women are both created equally in God's image, something that our misogynist culture for years has refused to acknowledge. Equally valuable, different roles. Eve was created for Adam, Moses writes. And I think that the differences goes far beyond just bearing children. There's men and women are so radically different. It doesn't amuse me, but in one sense it does when people try to say that men and women are so identical, and it's such defiance of everything we are learning about biology. Men, did you know that your brain cells are thicker than women's brain cells? So when your wife says you're bullheaded, you are. The women have more synapse connections between the left and the right hemispheres of their brains. That's why they can multitask so much better than we can. They just have the ability to communicate in ways that we don't. Just these differences just go on and on and on and on. And I've got friends who are scientists, and they're always filling me in on this stuff. But in the language of Moses, Eve was created as a, quote, helper fit for him. And that whole scenario is worked itself out in the Ephesian church with male headship. Now, what is Paul not saying? And this is really important. Number one, Paul is not arguing primacy based on the order of creation. He is not saying whatever was first is more important than what is second. Paul Jewett was the Fuller professor that really headed up the movement, I think, of evangelical feminism. And I think it's fair to call that. You can be an evangelical and you can be a feminist. Those are not mutually exclusive terms. And Paul Jewett was my systematics prophet. Fuller's a phenomenal teacher, unbelievable teacher. But he wrote his book, Man is Male and Female. And in his argument, in his book, he just says Paul's wrong. And the way in which he argues it is he says, if Paul's argument is right, then the animals are more important than Adam. The ground is more important than animals. If whatever is created first is more important or in more of a position of authority than what is created second. And the fact of the matter is that's simply, with all due respect to Professor Jewett, and I do mean that, that is not what Paul is saying. He's not saying whatever is first is primary to what is second. He was saying, look at the story in Genesis 2. Adam was created. Eve was then created from him, for him, and that should tell us something. So there is no broad stroke teaching on primacy of creation. The fact of the matter is, in Genesis 1, we are created as the apex of creation. And so the final act of creation is more significant than the initial ones, right? We are not primordial scum that washed up on the beach somewhere. We are created intentionally with purpose as the apex of God's creation, the only part of creation that has the ability to image him to one another and to image him back up to him. We're the only ones that are capable of living in communion with God. We are the apex of creation. And so the message of Genesis 1 is that which is created last is the most significant. But in Genesis 2, there's something totally different going on.
You're saying that first is not first, it's kind of a arms and legs. That's all it does.
And this is what Paul does all the time. When he quotes the Old Testament, he expects you to know the whole context of it. You get into Romans 4, and there's quotations from David in there, and at first glance, it doesn't make any sense. Then when you read the thing about David in context, you go, oh, that's what's going on. And Paul expected his people to know the whole story. And I think same way here, he's used plaso to pull people. If he just talked about creation, it'd be confusing. But he chooses the rare verb that is used in Genesis 2 to pull people's attention to the whole story of Genesis 2 and what Genesis 2 teaches us. I don't know if I'd call it metonymy, but it is a part for the whole, yes, in that sense. Yeah.
Calvin addresses this. He says that it's not like John the Baptist was created with Jesus. John the Baptist came first.
Yeah.
It's the relationship of he was created specifically to be a helper for him.
Right. And so, yeah, John the Baptist I never thought of it that way, but was the helper for Jesus. Yeah. You just had to get Calvin into the discussion. I see, we know about this. Yeah, so it's, anyway, that's number one. A second thing that is said about this verse is that the real, and they would say the underlying, I think it's a fair way to say, I'm trying to be really fair in how I say things. So if I say something that sounds like I'm not adequately describing the other positions, let me know, and I'll try to fix it. There is a lot written that the underlying thing going on here is everything is due to Eve's lack of education. And so the issue is not something about maleness and femaleness. It is that there is a, Adam was formed first. He was the one that was educated by God. He was the one that was taught, and Eve wasn't. And the trajectory of the argument is that if women are taught, then none of the restrictions in 11:12 are going to apply to them. And so just the argument is that a lot of what's going on here is due to the lack of education. The assumption is that that Eve was not taught. I would say, well, first of all, it's not what the text says. But secondly, I think Eve clearly was taught. When the snake came to her, when Satan came to her, even though she added to it, she clearly had been taught that she was not to eat of the tree. So that Eve was taught, and that, again, the idea is that if the Ephesian women would be taught, then none of this would apply to them. Well, it doesn't work with Adam and Eve. Eve had to have been taught. Adam had to have taught her, or God had taught her. We don't know. We're not told. A third thing that is often said about verse 13 is that the reason that Paul puts verse 13 is not because he really believes it at a deep, universal, abiding level, but rather he just said, if we have a bunch of women teaching in the church, it's going to cause this culture so much offense that they won't listen to the gospel. And so this is just some kind of temporary argument that Paul puts in place because of cultural mores. Is that a fair way to say it? All right. And the comparison is often made to slavery and Paul's what appears to be his tacit acceptance of slavery. If Paul had preached against slavery, it would have greatly endangered the spread of the gospel. A third of the Roman Empire were slaves. And if you start saying that slavery is inherently evil, then you would have such ramifications that the gospel would no longer spread. And so a comparison with slavery is made. And I guess I would have two reactions. One is that Paul doesn't tacitly accept slavery. He plants the germs and eventually the full statement in Philemon for the abolition of slavery. And so he wasn't that concerned about the social cultures of the day. His focus was on evangelism. His focus was on discipleship. His focus wasn't on changing social structures. That doesn't mean he liked it. And it doesn't mean that he said things that eventually helped Wilbur Wilberforce, among other people, get rid of at least at some level, the slave trade. So I don't accept the parallel with slavery because I think slavery is wrong, and I think the Bible says it's wrong. But I guess I would also say, to people who say, well, Paul was just afraid of offending people, I say, I don't think Paul was afraid of offending people. I mean, I really don't. Jesus wasn't afraid of offending people, and the gospel spread just fine, thank you very much. I think this idea of doing things because it might bring offense is you got to be really, really careful with that argument. Certainly, you got Paul, Romans 13, saying, respect the governing authorities, respect Nero. You have Jesus saying, give to Caesar what is Caesar, and then give to God what is God's. So, you have some deference to social customs and mores and things like that. But if it's simply, if women and men are supposed to have exactly equal roles, I can't imagine Paul saying, well, I don't want to offend anyone, so I'm not going to say it. I just don't think that's Paul. So I see verse 13 as Paul grounding his reason in creation. I should also add, there's a lot in the literature about needing to get back to the pre-fall condition. Right? You've heard this? A lot of people saying that the concept of authority, if you've read The Shack, you got a really good dose of this. And I like The Shack, by the way. I love God being portrayed as a black woman. I just think it's a wonderful image. And God is neither male nor female. I don't have any trouble with black women as an image for God. But Paul Young did have that entire chapter on the complete lack of any kind of authority within the Godhead. Did you read that? How many of you read The Shack? That's very interesting. I'd really encourage you to read it. It is a story of the lavish love of God. And there will be things that you don't like in it, like there are things in my commentary you don't like. That you don't read books that you like 100%. And Paul Young, it's not a universalist. I've heard him say it repeatedly in print, on the radio. He is not a universalist. He believes in a heaven and in a hell. He doesn't believe that everyone's going to heaven. Going to heaven. I mean, these are charges that are made against him. And there are people that don't like the fact that he wrote only on the love of God and not on the wrath of God. And I've been in theological debates where he say, you can't talk about the love of God without talking about the wrath of God. Phooey. Of course I could talk about the love of God. There's nothing wrong in that. But anyway, he is a... There are, I'm completely getting off track here. What was I saying? See, I went and got a, yeah. And so the idea is that the relationships of authority between husbands and wives and men and women is the result of the fall. And all authority is inherently evil, right? I mean, that's core in feminism. All authority is inherently evil, and so what we have to do is push back through the fall to the pre-fall condition. The problem with the argument is Genesis 2 comes before Genesis 3. So whatever you want to do with Genesis 2, it happened in creation as part of God's design before the fall. And it's such an easy argument. I'm not really quite sure why very bright, intelligent people argue that we have to get past the fall to where there is no authority structures, when there, I think, are authority structures in Genesis 2.
Maybe they're talking about going back to Genesis 1.
Yeah.
Male and female.
Male and female have created them, but I mean but that would mean that 1 and 2 are contradictory. And Genesis 1 and 2 just have different purposes. I don't think you can make them contradictory, but yeah. Anyway, so this is Paul grounding his argument in creation. And did I mention, was it to you all I mentioned that my favorite time in grad school was the arguing I had with Daryl and Craig on Thursday afternoons? And this is something that came up in part of the discussion. And this is what I heard over and over again. Bill, this is grounded in creation. This isn't a temporary thing. This is how God built things. And they convinced me. They convinced me at that point. So I think verse 13 is very important. You've got to raise the question, though, is verse 13 cultural? Is this whole argumentation cultural? I've been talking a bit about that. And again, let me stress, there are very good people that say this is cultural. I don't agree with them, but I've learned to respect them. I respect Gordon to the highest. There have been other people that I've worked with, that I've talked with, that I've argued with, that has read the commentary before it went to the printer, to, am I representing your positions fairly, all this kind of stuff. There are good evangelicals that I respect and that I care for that say, no, this is totally cultural. I just can't get past verse 13. And I don't want to get past verse 13. I believe God created us differently. He created us to have different roles, The gender differences are not due to sin. I do not believe that androgynous beings are God's ultimate design. And I think that gender differences are woven into the very fabric of creation, and those gender differences are to be reflected in our marriages. They are to be reflected in how we run our church. I will tell you that if I ever change my mind, this is what I would do. There are some people that say that even in first century Ephesus, that Paul wasn't really limiting the role of women. I just can't get there. In first century Ephesus, it has to be a limitation of roles. I just can't read the text any other way. But I think Gordon Fee's position, where he says everything is ad hoc, meaning everything in the pastorals is, the superstructure is that it is a reflection of the problems in Ephesus, and once those problems are gone, the teaching doesn't apply in other contexts. If I were to ever change my mind, I think I would go that direction. Partly out of my love for Gordon, but also it's just the only way I could move away from what I think the text says. What keeps me from thinking that what applied in Ephesus doesn't apply to us now is verse 13. And Paul doesn't list cultural reasons, he lists creative reasons in creation. And so that's there. Now, having said that, though, I want to read you a couple things, because we're all guys here, and it's really hard to understand women from women's standpoint, isn't it? I mean, and it's really important that we do understand our wives and our daughters and the women in our churches, because they come from a different kind of context. We were raised, many of us, in cultures that really viewed women as second-class citizens. And so it is not a surprise to me at all that so many women are so angry. I think if I were a female, I'd probably be mad too. This is Housekeeping Monthly, all right? This is 1955. So this is 2 years after I was born, so it's 58 years ago. This was the Good Wife's Guide, all right? You're not going to believe what I'm about to read, but it's a Xerox out of the magazine. This was what was being taught. This is what it took to be a good wife. Have dinner ready. Plan ahead. Prepare yourself for your husband coming home. Take 15 minutes to rest so you'll be refreshed when he arrives. Be a little gay and a little more interested in him. Clear away the clutter. One last trip through the main part of the house just before your husband comes home from work. Gather up all the school books and clean up the house. Over the cooler months of the year, you should prepare and light a fire for him to unwind by. Your husband will feel free as he has reached a haven of rest. Cater for his comfort, and it will give you intense personal satisfaction. No. Show sincerity in your desire to please him. Well, by itself, that's true, and I should show sincerity to please Robin as well. Remember, his topics of conversation are more important than yours. Now. Never complain if he comes home late or goes out to dinner or other places of entertainment without you. Instead, understand. Don't complain if he's late home for dinner or even if he stays out all night. Now, yeah, you are being recorded. You do know that. That mic is turned on in the middle of the room. All right. Have a cool or warm drink ready for him. Don't ask him questions about his actions or question his judgment. You have no right to question him. And the final statement is, a good wife always knows her place. Yeah. That is the culture that our wives were raised in. It is a culture that says women are not as important as men. That daughters are not as important as sons. I'll show my bias on something. The sons go out and play. The girls are only good to cheer their brothers on. I despise the concept of cheerleaders. I'm sorry. It is, I'm a man, and that's demeaning to me for women. It's so hard to remember, men, the culture that has formed that our wives and our daughters grew up in. But my daughter's Kirsten. She's 23 now, and as I told you, she's a grad student of University of Oregon in church history. If any of you want to hire someone with a master's in church history, let me know. As far as I know, there are no jobs in church history. But I always told my kids, you go to college to learn to think, you worry about jobs later. And they believe me. Anyway, when Kirsten, we're a pretty conservative home. My wife is especially conservative. We had TV, but we didn't watch much of it. We homeschooled. So there was quite a bit of control that Robin had over the kids. They absolutely loved being homeschooled. And my son's never had a B in his life. So this whole myth of homeschool kids are not as bright or not as social, they really need to meet my two kids because they're brilliant out of their minds and they're just people magnets. Anyway, but what I'm trying to say is that we really put our arms around our kids very carefully. All right, no feministic influences, that kind of stuff. Walked into Kirsten's room, and I think she was 6 years old, and her bulletin board, she had Xeroxed a Bible verse, and it was out of the ESV, so it had a he, and she had crossed out he and put her, and pinned it up on her bulletin board. I said, Robin, what have you been teaching our daughter? No. And I just said, do you know anything about this? And Robin goes, no, I've never seen it before in my life. So we talked to Kirsten later on and say, KK, I saw it. We call her KK. I said, KK, I saw your thing on your bulletin board about the verse. Yeah, it's a neat verse, isn't it, Daddy? And I go, yeah, it's a good verse. I noticed that you crossed out the him and put a her. Yeah. And I said, did you feel that you were left out because it said him and not her? And I'll never forget a look on her face. It was, well, of course. How else would I read it? I mean, the verse reads like it's written to my big brother. It's not written to me. And I think it's written to me. It applies to me too, Daddy, doesn't it? And I go, yes, sweetie, it does apply to you as well. So here's a girl who's protected with very little outside influence that sees the male-oriented language and she thinks that she's left out. That's why I'm on the NIV. That was kind of the thing that pushed me onto the NIV. Said I wanted a Bible for Kirsten, but one that was true to the Greek and true to the Hebrew, but one that she wouldn't have to be crossing words out before she pinned them up on her bulletin board. So I just say this to say, guys, we need to understand the women have such a totally, radically different set of pressures on them. Now, men are getting a different set of pressures, aren't they? We have a rule in our house called dumb male ads. And that, I mean, males are stupid in ads now, aren't they? I mean, it used to be the women were stupid. Now the men are stupid. And so we just have this ongoing list of how many dumb male ads that portray men as stupid that we can possibly see. And I saw the statistics the other day. 10 times more men than women are arrested for drunkenness. 83% of serious crimes in America are committed by men. 25 times more men than women are in jail. The SAT scores of men over the last about 10 years have dropped 400 points. There are now more women in grad school than there are men because our culture has decided to flip-flop and to punish men for being males. So our boys are growing up in a totally different culture where we're viewed as the enemy and the stupid kind of thing, and the women are the smart ones that really should be running the homes. So this is just the force of culture on us. So what I'm asking you is that for those of you that are complementarians like I am, please understand the incredible cultural forces that are at work on our wives and our children, and that are seeking to define them as second-class citizens.